because I became the principal investigator introducing a new drug to one of the top hospitals in the world. And it turns out you can't just walk in and say, "Hi, I've got this new drug dalbavancin, I'd like to give it to patients." And the reason for that is that they don't trust people like me, doctors, to do experiments that are in your best interest. And they have very good reason to be suspicious. And history is littered with stories of doctors who were once left to patrol themselves, to decide what was ethical and what wasn't, committing egregious crimes against patients, things that have been widely reported, but also more subtle things. And as someone on the ethics committee, I was acutely aware of all of this. I think many people are familiar with the Nazi doctors. There's a book I quote called Doctors from Hell about the experiments they did. But that was only one thing. There was many more stories. I think people have also heard about Tuskegee, where we had government-funded scientists who were intentionally withholding treatment for syphilis from Alabama sharecroppers. And it wasn't that they decided to treat some of them and not some of them. They just never told them that a new treatment had come that could completely eradicate their infection. And syphilis is something that you can pass sexually transmittedly. You can also pass it congenitally. So these were people who were spreading this infection to their wives, to their unborn children. And this went on for decades. Started in the 1930s. Finally ended in the 1970s when a whistleblower stepped forward and said, "Do you realize what's happening?" The truth was nobody did, until there was congressional testimony. And the Tuskegee incident shed to light the kind of transgressions that doctors had been committing for generations. Things like injecting viruses, herpes viruses, into mentally defective children, or sterilizing people against their will, or injecting cancer cells into people for experiments. All of this was done, in some ways, privately, but in other ways it was out in the open. The doctors were writing about this in academic circles because doctors were policing themselves. And when all of this came to light in the mid-1970s, a new institution was born, which was called the Institutional Review Board, the IRB. So every hospital now has a board, an IRB, which looks at clinical trials and the ethical dimensions of it, so that the next time you're in a hospital, if somebody like me comes up and says, "Hey, would you like to be a part of my clinical trial?" it has to be approved by that IRB. And they ended up being an unexpected nemesis for me, because I spent nearly a year trying to write a protocol, trying to design a trial that they would approve. And month after month, they said, "This is not acceptable." And it really wounded me. I write about how difficult that was, because I thought I was trying to do something very important for patients. And I was. But their stamp of approval really means something. And so you may find yourself in an emergency room with a doctor like me coming up to you saying, "Hey, do you want to be a part of this study?" They can't do that unless an IRB approves it. And one of the fascinating things I found after I finally got approval was that wasn't the end of the story with the studying superbugs. The first person I approached in my superbug trial was a lawyer who had been working for a Fortune 500 company for his entire career. He's in his 70s, recently retired. I handed him this thick packet that had outlined every single aspect of the trial, what a superbug is, what the antibiotic is, how we got into this mess, how his participation was going to help us. He took one look at it, flipped through it, put it on his lap, and he said, "Dr. McCarthy, I only have one question for you. Would you give this drug to your own mother?" Again, it caught me off guard, kind of like the locust question I got in Richmond. And I said, yes, I would. It took me a moment to gain the confidence, but what was so fascinating to me, and I write about this in the book, is that he was able to cut through all kinds of red tape and all kinds of jargon to get to the heart of the matter, which is, how much do you really trust this process? How much do you really trust what you're doing? And the truth was, I hadn't thought about that. But once I had, a lot of stuff came very clear to me. The next patient who I went to approach was a security guard who had a 10th grade education. And one of the things I found when I asked him if he wanted to do my trial was he said, sure. And I said, well, I need to get informed consent, and here's the paperwork for it. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll sign wherever. And I knew that I paid for this microphone. Can we, all right? So one of the things that I found, how are we doing now? One of the things that I found is that some people thought they needed to enroll in my trial so that I would give them good medical care, which is not a position I wanted to be in, and that wasn't the truth. But it showed me what tremendous power I had over these patients. And that's one of the things, whenever things get uncomfortable for me, I like to write about it. And that makes my hospital's PR department very nervous. And that leads me to, I think, shifting gears a little bit to talk to you about how New York-Presbyterian has a very aggressive PR arm. And I've been bumping up into that for the last year because I've been the only person willing to talk about superbugs. And they don't like that.